The night of March 15th, 1847, Cumberland County, Virginia, a scream ripped through the countryside, but it wasn't the cry of an animal being slaughtered. It wasn't the sound of childbirth either. It was something else, something darker. When neighbors rushed to the Peton Plantation, what they found would haunt Virginia's history for generations. Inside the great house, 13 members of the Peton family lay butchered, their bodies dismembered and arranged with eerie precision. The cuts weren't wild or frenzied. They were surgical, almost professional, and that baffled investigators. The sheriff's report, locked away for more than a century, described incisions so exact they looked like the work of someone who knew human anatomy better than most doctors. But here's the detail that chills me the most. The prime suspect wasn't a physician. It was a man enslaved on the plantation. His name was Isaac, and after that bloody night, he vanished, without a trace. Now, before we dive deeper into Isaac's disturbing story, a quick note. If you're fascinated by these hidden corners of American history, the stories buried in courthouse vaults and deliberately erased from school books, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to see just how far these forgotten tales reach. Back to 1847. To understand the horror at Peton Grove, you need to picture Cumberland County itself. Rolling hills of tobacco fields stretched for miles. The James River wound lazily through the land, feeding the plantations that thrived along its banks. It was a world of sharp contradictions, lavish dinners and genteel society for the wealthy, endless backbreaking labor for the enslaved, and at the center of it all stood Peton Grove, nearly 2,000 acres of prime Virginia soil. The house itself was massive, 3 stories high, white columns, wraparound porches, perched on a rise that commanded the land. Built in the 1760s by Josiah Peton, it had passed down through generations, each one growing richer off tobacco and human lives. By 1847, Cornelius Peton, the grandson, was in charge. Medium height, silver hair even in middle age, and piercing gray eyes. Unlike many planters, Cornelius didn't hire overseers. He kept strict personal control over every aspect of plantation life. His wife Margaret came from a wealthy Richmond banking family, and together they raised 4 children, Samuel, Elizabeth, Thomas, and young Mary. Living with them were Cornelius's mother Prudence, still running the household at 78, and Margaret's sister Catherine. Then there was Cornelius's younger brother, Dr. Jonathan Pemberton, who often stayed at the house while treating patients in the county. So yes, the Petons were not just wealthy. They were powerful, connected, and deeply entrenched in Virginia society. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Cornelius had inherited 43 enslaved people, yet he was known for buying more under very unusual circumstances. While most planters purchased through markets in Richmond or Norfolk, Cornelius sought out men and women other slaveholders had labeled trouble, the kind of people considered too dangerous, too difficult, or too strange to control. And that's how Isaac arrived at Peton Grove in the fall of 1844. Isaac was unlike anyone else on the plantation. Over 6 feet tall, broad shoulders, hands so large they looked almost unnatural. But it was his eyes people remembered, the pale gray, almost colorless gaze that unsettled everyone who met it. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was brief, but his silence wasn't ignorance, it was observation. He noticed everything, and then there were his skills with a knife. Isaac had been trained in the slaughterhouse at his previous owner's estate in Prince Edward County. He could butcher a hog with flawless precision, faster and cleaner than any man around. He wasted nothing. He knew anatomy in a way that made him invaluable and terrifying, but whispers followed him. Livestock found mutilated without reason, carcasses arranged in strange, deliberate ways. Witnesses swore he lingered too long over slaughtered animals, staring at them, clothes spotless as if blood itself refused to touch him. His former master, Fielding Crawford, had been desperate to sell him. His letters described Isaac's behavior as disturbing in ways he didn't dare explain. Cornelius Peton, always looking for a bargain, saw only a skilled laborer at half the cost. And with that purchase, he unknowingly invited something far more sinister into Peton Grove. What happened 3 years later? The screams, the bodies. The mystery of Isaac's disappearance would leave Cumberland County shaken to its core, and we're just getting started. So stick with me until the end of this story, because the secrets buried in this case are more unsettling than you think. Cumberland County, Virginia, March 15th, 1847. At first, it seemed like any other day on the grand plantation of Peaton Grove. The air carried the smell of tobacco seedlings, the promise of another wealthy year. Margaret Peaton tended her kitchen garden. The children studied with their tutor from Richmond. Cornelius sat in his study, reviewing accounts that suggested this might be the most profitable season yet. Nothing felt unusual. Not yet, but by afternoon, the illusion of normalcy shattered. It began with Cornelius's younger brother, Dr. Jonathan Peaton, who had arrived the night before to check on several enslaved workers sick with what looked like influenza. He planned to make one last round before heading out again. But as he approached the quarters, something caught his attention. Silence. Too much silence. No children, no voices, no work songs. Even the smell of cooking fires was gone. And then, that odor, sharp, metallic, disturbingly familiar. Blood. Jonathan followed it to Isaac's cabin. Now Isaac was always private, always kept his door closed, even in the sweltering summer heat. But on this day the door stood slightly ajar, moving with the breeze. Across the threshold, dark stains. The doctor didn't have to guess what they were. His medical training told him immediately, blood. Not a little, too much. With his heart pounding, Jonathan pushed the door wide open, and what he saw inside froze him in place. The small bare room had been transformed into something grotesque. Isaac's few belongings were laid out with eerie, geometric order, but from the rafters hung what looked, at first glance, like sides of pork, only they weren't. As Jonathan's eyes adjusted, dread set in. The cuts were too clean, the proportions too human. These weren't animals. They were people. Each body had been dissected with an almost clinical detachment. Joints separated at perfect angles, organs removed with surgical precision. The remains looked less like the result of violence and more like a horrifying anatomy lesson. Jonathan stumbled back, shaking. His instincts told him to run, but his training forced him to see the details, the deliberate care, the cold precision. Whoever had done this hadn't rushed. They had worked slowly, methodically, like a butcher with all the time in the world. The doctor staggered out of the cabin, but the horror wasn't over. As he crossed the plantation grounds, he noticed more things that weren't right. The silence, the emptiness, the sense that something had scrubbed life itself out of Peaton Grove. When Jonathan reached the main house, his dread deepened. The front door was ajar. Margaret Peaton, meticulous, careful, would never have left it open. He called out for his brother. No answer. Inside, everything felt off. The dining table was still set, food congealing on the plates. Margaret's embroidery lay abandoned mid-stitch, the needle still dangling with blue silk thread. It was as if life had stopped in an instant, and then Jonathan saw it. Bloodstains. Faint but unmistakable, trailing up the grand staircase. Something had been dragged, something heavy. With his stomach turning, he climbed. At the top of the stairs, he opened the door to Cornelius's private study, and that's where he found him. Cornelius sat in his leather chair, positioned exactly as if he'd been writing in his ledger, only his head had been severed with terrifying precision and placed neatly on the desk before him, like some grotesque paperweight, and this was only the beginning of what Dr. Jonathan Peaton would discover that night inside the mansion. What's more terrifying than a brutal killing? A killing with no chaos, no panic, no sign of struggle. That's exactly what Dr. Jonathan Peaton faced as he walked through his family's grand Virginia home in March of 1847. The room looked ordinary, papers neat on the desk, furniture untouched, except for one horrifying detail. His brother Cornelius sat in his study chair, body perfectly posed, while his severed head rested neatly on the mahogany desk in front of him. It looked deliberate, careful, almost respectful, and Cornelius wasn't the only one. As Jonathan staggered through the house, he found every family member arranged in these nightmarish tableaus. Margaret, his brother's wife, sat in their bedroom, poised as if placing flowers in a vase. Her head had been removed and placed among the bouquet itself, like a grotesque centerpiece. The children were worse. Samuel, Elizabeth, Thomas, and little Mary, all seated on the nursery floor in a circle. Bodies arranged as if mid-game, but their heads had been set in the middle, facing one another. like they were whispering secrets. Their grandmother, old Prudence, was discovered in her rocking chair, appearing to gaze at the sunset. Her head sat neatly on a side table beside her spectacles and Bible, as if nothing had disturbed her final evening. Catherine, the unmarried sister, was found in the kitchen, bread dough still on the table. Her head positioned on the cutting board, every scene carried the same unnerving detail. There was no blood, no sprays on the walls, no pools soaking into the floors. It was as though each person had been killed somewhere else, quietly, cleanly, and then staged like figures in a dark theater. And the cuts. Jonathan couldn't ignore them. His medical training told him immediately these weren't the sloppy marks of rage. They were identical, precise, executed by someone who knew exactly where to cut. A single slice to the neck from behind, instant, painless, dead before they could even raise a hand. No one fought back. No one ran. By the time the sheriff arrived the next morning with deputies and the county coroner, the scene had already shaken Jonathan beyond words. But for Sheriff Hawthorne, a man hardened by 2 decades of violence on Virginia's frontier, even he struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't like a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a slave revolt. It wasn't even murder in the sense they knew it. It was something colder, smarter, clinical. The coroner, William Fitzgerald, confirmed the worst. Each victim killed the same way, jugular and carotid severed in a single motion, the work of someone with frightening anatomical knowledge. But there was something else. Something no one could explain. The bodies didn't behave like normal corpses. By the time Fitzgerald examined them, they'd been dead at least half a day. But the skin was still pink, warm to the touch, no rigor mortis, no pooling of blood. In fact, there was no blood at all, as if every drop had been drained. And then came another discovery: 3 enslaved people missing along with Isaac. Naturally, suspicion turned immediately toward them, but that theory didn't hold for long. When they searched the grounds, the missing were found. Moses, the field hand, still in his cabin. Sarah, the house servant, left in the kitchen garden. And Peter, Isaac's young assistant, inside the slaughterhouse. All 3 were dead. All 3 decapitated with the same terrifying precision, their heads carefully placed near their bodies. This was no revolt. This was something else entirely. That left only one man unaccounted for, Isaac. The search of his cabin revealed what Dr. Jonathan had glimpsed earlier, the grisly remains hanging with butcher-like perfection. But investigators found something even more chilling beneath the floorboards. Journals, dozens of them, written in a careful, educated hand. Inside, Isaac had recorded nearly 3 years of observations, day by day, hour by hour. He documented everything, the habits of every member of the Peaton household, their weaknesses, their routines, their fears. Even the enslaved community wasn't spared from his cold, meticulous notes. The journals read less like the thoughts of a man and more like the records of a scientist studying subjects in an experiment. And the scariest part? Isaac was still gone, vanished into the night without a single trace. So what really happened at Peaton Grove? Was Isaac a man who snapped under years of cruelty, or something far stranger? A killer with knowledge far beyond his station? And most of all, how did he disappear so completely, leaving behind one of the most baffling and horrifying cases in Virginia history? The answers remain buried in courthouse archives and whispered legends. But one thing's for sure, the massacre at Peaton Grove was unlike anything seen before or since. What if I told you the key to one of the most chilling crimes in Virginia's history wasn't found in blood, or footprints, or even eyewitness accounts, but in a stack of journals hidden beneath the floorboards of a cabin? When Sheriff Hawthorne's men pried up those boards inside Isaac's quarters, they uncovered notebooks that froze them in their tracks. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, far too refined for what anyone expected from an enslaved man in the mid-1800s. And the words? They revealed a mind that had been planning, watching, and experimenting for years. The earliest pages, written not long after Isaac's arrival in 1844, seemed almost harmless at first. Daily schedules, notes about where people went, when they woke, how the house sounded at night. But even those entries had an edge to them. Isaac wasn't just writing down routines. He was dissecting human behavior, cold, detached, like a scientist with lab specimens. As Professor Marcus Aldrich, the family's former tutor, worked through the journals, the tone shifted. Simple notes turned into controlled experiments. Isaac would move an object in the house. A vase shifted just a few inches on the mantel, just to see if anyone noticed. And they did. He wrote down Margaret Peaton's unease when she couldn't figure out why the room felt different. He mapped the creaking floorboards. He timed the family's sleeping patterns. For months he studied how sound carried through the house at night. By the time he was done, Isaac knew that house better than the people living in it. But the most disturbing part? The drawings. Page after page of anatomical sketches, muscles, bones, organs, done with such precision they looked like they belonged in a medical textbook. Where had he learned this? How could an enslaved man have knowledge that rivaled a trained physician? Professor Aldrich dug deeper into Isaac's past, and that's where the mystery only grew darker. Records from his supposed birthplace in Prince Edward County didn't match. No baptism, no birth record. Elders who had lived there their entire lives swore they'd never seen him before 1842. Then came Dr. Samuel Hutchinson's testimony. Hutchinson had been a physician on the Crawford Plantation where Isaac supposedly grew up. He remembered him all too well, not just because Isaac had assisted in surgeries, but because he had skills no one could explain. His steady hand, his uncanny precision. Hutchinson admitted Isaac was better with a blade than many licensed doctors, but Hutchinson also noticed something else. While others flinched at suffering, Isaac never showed an ounce of emotion. No empathy, no hesitation, just fascination. And then came the real bombshell. Before Isaac was sold to Cornelius Peaton, 3 enslaved workers on Crawford's plantation had died under suspicious circumstances. Officially it was called illness, but Hutchinson's private notes told a different story. Each body had a tiny puncture wound behind the ear, so small it was almost invisible. The kind of wound that could sever the brainstem instantly. The kind of wound only someone with surgical expertise would know how to make. When Hutchinson raised his concerns, Crawford buried them. Rather than risk attention, he quietly sold Isaac, at a reduced price, to the Peatons. Sheriff Hawthorne widened his search, asking questions on other plantations, and what he uncovered painted a terrifying picture. Wherever Isaac had lived, strange deaths followed. Peaceful, unexplained, but always with that same shadow of precision. Isaac wasn't just a runaway. He wasn't just a suspect. He was something else entirely, a predator hiding in plain sight, and this was only the beginning of what those journals revealed. What if I told you Isaac's story went back even further than anyone first realized? And the trail of death stretched across plantations long before Peaton Grove? Records from Chesterfield County revealed something shocking. Before Crawford, Isaac had belonged to another man, Benjamin Curthers. But Curthers didn't hold on to him for long. After only 3 months, he sold Isaac off, citing unacceptable behavior. What kind of behavior? At first, Curthers wouldn't say. But under Sheriff Hawthorne's pressure, the truth came out. During Isaac's short stay, several of Curthers' most valuable enslaved workers died. Each death looked natural on the surface. But every body carried the same nearly invisible mark behind the left ear. That wasn't the only thing. Curthers recalled how Isaac reacted to death. While others mourned, Isaac leaned in closer, examining corpses with the cold focus of a doctor at work. The breaking point came one night when Curthers found him in the quarters, standing over a fresh body, holding a slender, pointed tool. When confronted, Isaac calmly explained he was studying the effects of death on human tissue. That was all Curthers needed to hear. Isaac was sold within days. The evidence was piling up. This wasn't an isolated incident. Isaac had been moving silently through Virginia's plantation system, leaving a trail of suspicious deaths behind him. Law enforcement now realized the danger. If Isaac was still at large, he wasn't just Cumberland County's problem. He was a threat to the entire region. Sheriff Hawthorne began coordinating with sheriffs across neighboring counties, setting up a network of searches and alerts. And then, the investigation took a turn no one expected at Dr. Peaton's temporary lodgings in Cumberland Courthouse. A blacksmith named Samuel Woodson came forward. Woodson was a free man from Farmville, and he claimed to know Isaac from a time long before slavery. His story shattered everything people thought they knew about Isaac's past. According to Woodson, Isaac hadn't been born enslaved at all. His real name? Isaac Thornton. He'd once been a free man living in Philadelphia, working as an assistant to a respected physician and anatomist Dr. Marcus Whitfield. But Thornton's fascination with medicine had taken a sinister turn. Woodson described how Isaac's professional interest twisted into obsession. He began conducting unauthorized experiments on corpses at the medical college. These weren't scientific studies anymore. They were grotesque manipulations. Bodies arranged like sculptures. Anatomy treated as art. When Dr. Whitfield discovered what he was doing, he fired Isaac immediately and barred him from the college. But within weeks, corpses started disappearing from the anatomy lab. And worse, 3 recently deceased residents of Philadelphia were found staged in abandoned buildings, arranged in eerie, unnatural poses. Authorities launched a search for Isaac, but he slipped away before they could find him. Woodson believed that during his flight south, Isaac had been captured by slave catchers, mistaken for a runaway because of his mixed-race appearance and lack of free papers. That's how a once-free anatomist with formal medical knowledge ended up enslaved in Virginia. Dr. Peaton was shaken. If this account was true, everything fit. Isaac's education, his surgical precision, his cold detachment, and maybe even his motive. Years of bondage might have twisted his obsession into something darker, something vengeful. The massacre at Peaton Grove began to look less like random violence and more like calculated retribution. And then the reports started flooding in. From Buckingham County, livestock slaughtered and arranged in strange, almost ritualistic patterns. From Charlotte County, enslaved workers found dead in their quarters, each marked with that same tiny puncture behind the ear. And from Nottoway County, the most terrifying of all, an entire plantation family vanished. No blood, no struggle, just a home that felt watched. Stalked for weeks. Before everyone inside disappeared, Sheriff Hawthorne's search parties swept the countryside, barns, abandoned houses, even caves. But Isaac Thornton, once a free man, now a ghost moving through Virginia, had vanished without a trace. And what came next would be even more horrifying. What if the most terrifying killer wasn't the one you could recognize, but the one who could become anyone? That was the problem with Isaac. Nobody could agree on what he looked like. Some swore he was tall and menacing. Others said he blended right in, average height, nothing memorable at all. That chameleon-like ability to slip into new roles made him almost impossible to track, and incredibly dangerous. As weeks went by with no real leads, investigators shifted focus. If they couldn't pin down his face, maybe they could figure out his mind. That's when Professor Aldrich uncovered something chilling in Isaac's journals. The early entries were clinical, like a scientist's notes. But then, they took a dark turn. Isaac began writing about a final experiment. Not revenge, not rage, but what he called an artistic exploration of death itself. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to arrange death. His journals contained sketches of how he planned to position bodies, almost like props in a macabre performance. At Peaton Grove, the massacre hadn't just been murder. It had been a statement. And here's where it got even worse. Isaac wasn't working alone. Scattered through his journals were cryptic references to disciples, others who seemed to share his twisted fascination. Was this just one man's madness, or part of something much larger? Just when everyone thought the nightmare couldn't get darker, an unexpected witness stepped forward. Father O'Sullivan, a traveling priest, told Sheriff Hawthorne about a strange group he'd met on the road. They called themselves preachers, 4 of them in total. But their leader, a tall man with pale eyes, had an obsession with death and resurrection. The priest recalled how this man spoke of divine visions, instructions to transform human bodies into living sculptures. The way he described it was almost artistic, but underneath the words, Father O'Sullivan felt only horror. The description matched Isaac, and the group claimed they were heading to Powhatan County to stage a massive revival. Before Hawthorne could even mobilize his men, a desperate message arrived. Colonel William Randolph, a wealthy plantation owner, begged for immediate help. Something unspeakable had happened at his family estate. When lawmen arrived, what they found defied belief. Inside the Randolph mansion's grand parlor, 17 family members sat around a long dining table. Each body was carefully positioned, upright, dressed, arranged as if attending a feast. Their severed heads were neatly placed on china plates before them. The flickering glow of candles made the scene look disturbingly celebratory. But the ballroom was even worse. 32 enslaved people had been posed as dancers mid-celebration. Their heads, grotesquely swapped with members of the Randolph family, turned the entire tableau into a nightmarish illusion of unity, a scene that would never have existed in life. The detail was staggering. The staging would have taken hours, maybe days, and there was no way Isaac had done this alone. Dr. Peaton, brought in as medical support, confirmed what investigators suspected: multiple perpetrators. Isaac had gathered his disciples, and this time they had pushed further than before. Unlike at Petton Grove, not every victim had been granted a quick death. Some showed evidence of torture, kept alive long enough for Isaac to shape their final moments. Then came the most damning discovery. Hidden deep in the root cellar, investigators stumbled on a makeshift laboratory. Surgical instruments, anatomical charts, detailed notes describing cruel experiments. Isaac had turned the plantation into both a theater of death and a workshop for his evolving methods. And the most terrifying thought of all? If he had followers now, where would this madness spread next? This case leaves more questions than answers. Isaac wasn't just a killer. He was building something bigger, a twisted movement. What if I told you the Randolph Plantation massacre wasn't the end of Isaac's nightmare, but only the beginning? Because hidden deep inside that estate, investigators uncovered something far more disturbing. Sketches, precise, grotesque illustrations of future victims. Each drawing was mapped out like stage directions, positions, poses, arrangements. It was clear the Randolph slaughter had just been one chapter in what Isaac saw as a much bigger project, and then came the laboratory. This wasn't just a workshop. It was a torture chamber dressed up like a surgeon's theater. Shackles had been built with the kind of care you'd expect from a master carpenter. Not to heal, but to hold victims still while Isaac experimented on them. Alive. Dr. Peaton examined Isaac's notes and confirmed the horror. Isaac had been testing how long a person could remain conscious while dying. He wanted to capture the exact moment the human mind realized death was coming, and record it. Every cut, every injury, designed not to kill quickly, but to stretch out suffering as long as possible. But the darkest revelation? Isaac wasn't finished. Sheriff Hawthorne found fresh deliveries in the lab, surgical tools so new they hadn't even been used yet. And worse, maps. Detailed maps of neighboring plantations, each marked with notes about guard rotations, family routines, even the architecture of the homes. Isaac had studied them like a general preparing for war. Alongside the maps was a chilling timeline, a summer-long campaign of slaughter across central Virginia. Each massacre wasn't random. To Isaac, they were chapters in his twisted book, a treatise on the aesthetics of mortality, and the next target was already chosen, the Carrington Plantation. Less than 10 miles away, scheduled for the very next evening, a dinner party night, when the entire family would be gathered in one place. There was no time to waste. Hawthorne sent riders to warn the Carringtons and called in reinforcements from 5 surrounding counties. What followed became the largest manhunt Virginia had ever seen. Dozens of lawmen fanned out across the countryside, but Isaac was always a step ahead. How? He knew how to throw off dogs. Investigators found traces of substances he'd used to confuse bloodhounds, leaving false trails that led search parties in circles. He was moving through the woods like a ghost, taunting them. As night fell on the scheduled attack date, Isaac was still nowhere to be found. So the sheriff made a desperate choice. The Carrington Plantation itself would become bait. Colonel James Carrington, a seasoned war veteran, insisted the dinner go on as planned. 12 guests took their seats at the table, while nearly 30 armed men hid in the shadows of the property, ready to spring the trap. For a while, everything seemed normal. Too normal, then. It began. It started with a sound, faint scratching beneath the dining room floor. One guest, Mrs. Elizabeth Carrington, nervously mentioned it. Before anyone could react, the floorboards buckled. Wood splintered. And from below, 4 figures burst into the room like predators erupting from the earth. Isaac had tunneled his way under the house. Days of preparation, a secret network of tunnels, and now he and his disciples stood in the center of the feast. But this wasn't the same Isaac people remembered. His hair hung wild and filthy, his clothes smeared with substances no one wanted to identify. And his face? It wasn't detached anymore. Witnesses swore he looked enraptured, like a man in religious ecstasy, as though the slaughter itself was an act of worship. The 3 who followed him were just as unsettling. Two were formerly enslaved men who had joined his cause, and the third appeared to be a white overseer or small farmer. Whoever they were, they moved with deadly coordination, like soldiers rehearsing a ritual. What happened next was unlike anything Isaac had ever done before. This wasn't a quick massacre. This was theater. Instead of swift killings, Isaac dragged the ordeal out, making sure every guest watched what he was doing. The lawmen hidden throughout the house were paralyzed. They couldn't fire without hitting the very people they were there to protect. The dining room had become a trap, not for Isaac, but for everyone inside, and what unfolded inside those walls was a nightmare no one present would ever forget. What happens when a killer stops hiding his crimes and starts performing them like theater? That's exactly what unfolded the night Isaac struck the Carrington plantation. During the attack, his behavior revealed just how far his mind had unraveled. He didn't act like a murderer. He acted like a conductor, directing his disciples, arranging the room, and treating the screams of his victims like instruments in some twisted performance. For nearly 2 hours, the standoff dragged on. And instead of killing everyone outright, Isaac gave his captives a lecture. He spoke calmly, almost like a professor, about death, the soul, and the beauty he believed could be created from lifeless bodies. Witnesses said he insisted murder wasn't murder at all. To him, it was sculpture. The human body was his raw material, and he was simply shaping it into art. The dinner guests were frozen in terror, forced to listen as he showed off 2 victims he had already killed. He even explained the techniques he used to preserve their appearance, pointing out details he thought were beautiful in their final poses. Outside, hidden lawmen and Dr. Peeton listened through the windows. Realizing the truth, Isaac didn't see himself as a killer anymore. He saw himself as an artist, and worse, his disciples completely agreed with him. But then, a breakthrough. Colonel Carrington, a seasoned military man, managed to signal the officers outside using a prearranged code, just the position of his hands on the dining table. The message was clear. Isaac and his disciples had bunched together in a way that gave the officers one perfect chance to end it. What happened next was over in seconds. The windows shattered as lawmen stormed the room from 3 sides. Isaac, mid-sentence, didn't even get the chance to react before several bullets tore through him. His disciples tried to grab hostages as shields, but the ambush had been too well planned. Within moments, all 4 attackers lay dead on the dining room floor, their blood pooling into one final, accidental tableau. Isaac was gone. But the nightmare he created wasn't over. Over the next few months, investigators poured through his journals and laboratory. What they uncovered was staggering. Isaac and his disciples were tied to suspicious deaths across 6 counties, going back almost 4 years. The death toll? More than 100 lives. And the most disturbing discovery, Isaac's network didn't die with him. Letters hidden in his lab revealed correspondence with sympathizers in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. He'd been spreading his philosophy, death as art, to others, recruiting followers who were eager to learn. Even after his death, his ideas lived on. Arrests followed across the South, but many slipped away, vanishing into the West. The psychological impact was enormous. Plantation owners across Virginia suddenly doubled their security, terrified that another Isaac might be hiding in their midst. Trust between enslaved and free populations fractured even further. The thought that someone this intelligent, this skilled, could live among them undetected for years. It shook the very foundations of their society. But perhaps the darkest revelation. Isaac's philosophy had followers. His journals contained letters praising his work, people writing that they wanted to be part of it. His twisted belief that murder could be justified as art had struck a chord with men and women consumed by their own rage and resentment. When Virginia's official report was finally written, it was sealed immediately, hidden from the public until after the Civil War. Even then, Isaac's true identity remained a mystery. Samuel Woodson's account of him once being a free man in Philadelphia was never verified. No records matched. The report speculated he could have been an educated free black man who deliberately entered slavery for access to victims. Or maybe he was of mixed heritage, able to move between identities when it suited him. What was undeniable was his brilliance, his education, his psychological manipulation. His ability to move like a ghost through entire communities while planning massacres with military precision. And the most chilling conclusion? Isaac might not have been alone. His letters hinted that others just like him were already operating in the shadows of the South. The legacy of Isaac's crimes lasted for decades. His campaign revealed the weaknesses of the plantation system, the danger of assuming enslaved people couldn't plan or execute complex operations. It showed how systems of oppression created blind spots where predators could thrive. In the end, Isaac wasn't a monster out of legend. He was something far worse, proof that human intelligence, twisted by obsession, can become the deadliest weapon of all. So what do you think? Was Isaac's true identity ever uncovered? Or did parts of his story die with him? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that peel back the darkest corners of history, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with a friend who loves chilling mysteries, because the scariest monsters are always the ones that look human.